Hello everyone. Welcome to season two of the Dialexicon podcast, a channel targeted to the youth where we critically engage with leading scholars and connect philosophy to contemporary social issues, all at a digestible level. My name is Rohan Goyal, and this week we are joined by Dr. Chetan Chetty. Dr. Chetty is a political and moral philosopher and assistant professor at Lafayette College with a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. Hi, Dr. Chetty. How are you today?
Hi, good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. So before we get into some of your research, obviously I want to begin by talking about your background. So could you introduce
Mhm.
yourself, maybe talk about your work, why you got into the field, and sort of your academic journey more broadly?
Yeah, so I got into philosophy pretty much right from the beginning of undergrad. I wasn't initially planning to major in philosophy, um, but I decided, I think, at the end of my first year, if not the start of my second year, that philosophy was probably going to be the major for me. And more than that, I was quite passionate about it. So yeah, a little bit about my background. I was born in India, and my family moved to Singapore when I was about 2 years old. And so I grew up in Singapore. I went through the education system there, and yeah, like a lot of places, philosophy isn't something that you get exposed to,
Hmm.
in school. So I only really learned that there was such a thing as philosophy as an academic subject in college.
Hmm.
I um, I did read some philosophical texts, mostly introductory things, when I was in high school, just out of interest. But when you do a casual read of something, you may not, unless you really follow it and pursue it yourself seriously, which is difficult to do. Um, it, I never really got a real sense of how philosophy is done until I got into the classroom
Sure.
and did it at the undergraduate level. So I went to the National University of Singapore. That's where I did my undergrad. And then because I was so excited about doing philosophy, I decided I was going to pursue graduate school. And I came to the US and I did my master's initially in philosophy, and then I joined a PhD program. I did my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and recently, not about 5 years ago, I graduated, and I've been assistant professor at Lafayette College since.
Yeah, so I'm curious, did you initially plan on majoring in philosophy in your undergrad, or was that like a switch that you had during that time?
It was a switch. I was initially considering a couple of subjects. I was
Hmm.
thinking about political science. I was
Hmm.
considering English. For a while, I was thinking about economics, and took a bunch of intro courses,
Hmm.
in each of these disciplines. And it was it was philosophy that drew me the most. It wasn't even an introductory level course in philosophy. It was not the philosophy 101 course. It was there was a 200 level course I took in political philosophy in my first semester, and that was the most interesting course that entire semester for me. And I've never really left political philosophy. That's been my primary area of
Sure.
research and interest. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I guess why did you find it more interesting than like these other subjects? Like what drew you to
I
this?
I think what was particularly fascinating for me was it was the fact that people were thinking in a particular way that I couldn't I as I mentioned, never been exposed to, but also I found quite uh, refreshing, exciting, alluring, I suppose. The the approach being this what is often called the analytic method, or roughly, it's not a precise approach as such, but the idea that you can explore some of the most fundamental questions that face us as human beings using reason and
Mhm.
logic and careful argumentation was such a breath of fresh air to
Yeah.
me, because I previously thought, there's some argumentation, but there's a lot of, emotions and
Mm.
rhetoric and so on that characterizes such, dialogue on such topics, whether that's
Yeah.
political or some other domain, right? So to see that people have been doing that and been doing that for, obviously a very long time, and be exposed to that, um, I just found it incredible. It was the most exciting thing
Mm.
um, I had come across, and I just wanted to do more of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely like makes sense and resonates with um a lot of what I experience in relation to this field, and I think what a lot of my friends do as well is sort of rigorous, almost scientific analysis of, more interesting questions. Um,
Mhm.
uh, is there like a specific, you mentioned analytic philosophy, is there like a specific school of analytic philosophy or philosopher that you particularly are interested in?
Um, like with most professional philosophers, there are some famous philosophers that we uh, are attracted to. I don't know if there's one particular one for me. I think I can name a few that I've always been attracted to. Their approach, their way of thinking and arguing. I would say Immanuel Kant is an obvious uh, one there. David Hume,
Hmm.
um, and John Rawls. I would say those three in particular are maybe the most influential for me. Um, and they certainly were when I was an undergraduate, and their influence still has
Sure.
lasted till today. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And uh I think that's a good segue into my next question. And this is a question I ask everybody who comes on, which is a very simple question of what is philosophy? So there's been a wide range of answers I've heard so far. So I'm interested in what your take is on like what is the point of this field, or even more broadly, like what is the field, I guess.
So I think, yeah, you've this is probably something you've already encountered, but it's notoriously difficult to pin down, and you won't,
Yes.
unlike with most other disciplines, you're going to get quite a variety, a wide variety of
Hmm.
answers as to what philosophy is. But so here's my take. I think the most accurate, but also uncomplicated definition or description I've heard of what philosophy is the following. Philosophy is the discipline that asks the kinds of questions that come naturally to children. Maybe teenagers. Children and teenagers. Using the sorts of methods that come naturally to lawyers, right? So if you think about what that's really just saying is you're asking these very fundamental questions that you will invariably find, children, or you yourself might have been asking these kinds of questions. Many children do, right? What is truth? What is knowledge? Like, why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a God, right? And so on.
Yeah.
What's the right thing to do, and so on. But in philosophy, you try to answer these questions using something like the method that lawyers use when they present arguments, when they make a case for their position, right? This kind of careful use of um, logical reasoning, right?
Hmm.
uh, deductive reasoning, even, right?
Sure.
So that's roughly that's what I take to be maybe the most
Hmm.
useful definition if somebody were to ask me what philosophy is. Yeah.
Yeah, and to what extent is sort of the use cases of answering these questions? Like, can you truly actually answer these questions? And B, if you do sort of explore these questions, what do you gain out of that, I guess?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's another difficult one. Um, I think there are broadly two use cases. I
Hmm.
think on the one hand, its use case is kind of just the fact that we're invariably going to be asking these questions anyway,
Hmm.
and whether or not we study philosophy, in in the classroom, in high school or college and whatnot, there is a discipline out there that has proposed answers. Obviously, not every philosopher has the same answers, but there are people out there who've proposed answers. So its first use case is just that it concerns the kinds of things that are inescapable for pretty much anyone who, just by virtue of the fact that they're a human being and they they reflect at various points in their lives, uh, um, they reflect upon these fundamental questions, right? Again, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and value theory more generally. Um, they're going to be looking for those answers, and philosophy promises to at least help you think more carefully as you search for those answers. So that's the
Hmm.
first use case. The second use case, I think, is that it even if you're not able to find an answer,
Yeah.
maybe you for most of your life or till the end you feel very conflicted about what the right answer is to any one of these questions. Doing philosophy, and again, I don't mean to say that doing philosophy requires being in the classroom and doing it,
Yeah.
right? But doing philosophy um, uh, can be incredibly useful in just sharpening your reasoning abilities, and that has both direct and indirect benefits, right? So it can help you at least set aside certain answers that maybe you can say quite confidently are not good answers. Maybe you're not
Mm.
sure what the right answer is, but you can say, okay, but those ones over there are not the right ones for sure,
Yeah.
right? So at least helps you narrow the range
Sure.
of plausible answers. But second, in the process of doing that, right, it has these spin-off benefits of getting you to think more rationally, more critically, and that obviously is incredibly important because we live in society, we live amongst other people, we live in many places. People have the ability to communicate their political preferences, right? In democratic system, for example, right? And so if if they're not thinking about these questions systematically and carefully, then that shows up in how we um, how we live together with other people in society, and the kinds of social norms and the sorts of political rules we have, and so on and so forth, the kinds of institutions and so on. Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I think
yeah.
the sort of cultivation of analytical skills are certainly more important than ever. Do you think there are any certain types of questions that are maybe like more important or more uh, rich to ask than others, maybe, if that's a correct way of framing that? Like, is there a certain field
Mhm.
of study that is maybe more relevant or more interesting than another, just in your opinion, I guess?
Well, I mean, given the fact that I primarily work in moral and political philosophy, I might be a little bit biased, but I would say
Sure.
the questions in value theory and epistemology are probably more relevant to us, given our day-to-day existence. This is not to say that I don't think metaphysical questions are important. I think they're hugely
Yes.
important. And in fact, when you think more about the foundational questions in ethics, at least, you're doing metaphysics, or at least you need to confront metaphysical questions. So I don't want to discount um, the role of metaphysics or thinking about metaphysical questions, but just more immediately for most people, I think these questions in value theory, particularly questions in moral and political philosophy, I think are going to at least appear to be most relevant.
Okay.
Um, I do want to say that I think epistemology is in some ways maybe the most fundamental, maybe because you need to think about how you're gaining knowledge, what counts as having knowledge about the world, right? And regardless of what specific issue you're interested in philosophy, um, you need to have some sort of view about um, what makes it the case that you know or don't know,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
This is obviously particularly relevant today. If you just think about the world we live in and the
sure.
fact there's so much more disagreement about even seemingly obvious um, facts about our world, right?
Hmm.
People disagree. Uh, they're skeptical about whether you can gain knowledge about various sorts of even mundane things, and so so I think epistemology is hugely important too. Yeah, so I don't know if I've given you a very narrow answer. I mean, I think it's maybe maybe reflects where we are in the world right now. In the age of social
Yeah.
media and now AI and whatnot. That um, philosophy, in some ways, I think has many more areas of philosophy have become relevant because we were in a kind of crisis epistemically, morally, right, in various places in the world. And so we're having to confront these questions, um, and we're doing it under a lot of pressure. We feel the stress, right? People don't know what news to believe. What is real and what is not, right? Who's
Hmm.
deceiving them? They don't know how to shape their political systems, and there's deep disagreements about that, right? Um, yeah, so I don't know. I don't think there's a very small subset of
Of course.
classical philosophical questions that are applicable today, just given the times that we live in.
Sure. Yeah. So how about this? Let's so you mentioned value theory. So let's take that for an example. And before that you mentioned Rawls. So I guess the combination of value theory and ideal theory or sort of leads me to the question of like what is your understanding of what a just society looks like? And sort of what are the ways that philosophers or thinkers have gone upon like approaching that ideal, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's a that's a big question. So I'll make an attempt. I've mentioned Rawls already, like you said. So I am quite influenced by the Rawlsian approach. I
Okay.
think like a lot of people in political philosophy. So I think broadly that the just society is one that is one that is fundamentally fair in some sense. So where I think fairness involves balancing um, the competing claims, the competing rational and reasonable claims that people can make against each other about
Yeah.
how they should organize society. Um, and the just society is one that does it in a way that respects everybody's status as equal members, right? As members that are entitled to certain sorts of freedoms.
Hmm.
Um, you mentioned, well, Rawls famously thought that the way to answer this question, what is the just society, is to do something like what he called ideal theory. Namely, he thought that you ought to um, first focus on um, what reasonable and rational individuals under certain hypothetical conditions in which they're um, deprived of information about various contingent facts about themselves. So facts about like what your race is, your gender is, your socioeconomic status, right? Who your friends are, your natural talents, how intelligent, how strong you are, and so on. Um, if you're deprived of these kinds of things and you're deliberating about what kind of society you want to live in,
Hmm.
what would be the society you want to live in as a rational agent, then whatever principles we get from that deliberative process, those principles would make up the just society, right?
Yeah.
That's the Rawlsian story, and that's part of ideal theory. He's setting aside all kinds of complications that you normally otherwise would have to think about, right? So, for instance, the fact that many societies don't have enough resources to feed everyone, or the fact that many places war is happening, right? And so, how do you deal with, or the fact that there is enormous other kinds of injustices, right? We think
Hmm.
about, systemic racism, slavery, and so on, right? So think about the various kinds of injustices. And how do you resolve these issues? And Rawls says, well, first we need to think about what the ideal or perfectly just society looks like. And then we can work our way from these non-ideal conditions to what the ideal society looks like. So we need to
Yeah.
have an exemplar figured out first, and then we work toward it.
Yeah, I think the model you just described is certainly like the prototypical ideal theory framework. Obviously, that leads me to the question of what is non-ideal theory, and sort of when is that useful as opposed to ideal theory? What sort of current problems do you see that are relevant to both of these theories? So yeah, if you could just talk about the interaction between these two sides.
Yeah, this is a complex issue. So the debate about ideal and non-ideal theory and the relative merits of each is sort of it's really a debate about a collection of issues. Broadly, very broadly, non-ideal theory concerns the problems that we face um, in our actual unjust world with unjust institutions and with um, individuals who are either imperfectly or not at all motivated to to do what they ought to do, right?
Hmm.
Um, so uh, non-ideal theory, you might say, is concerned with injustice, to put it very, very simply, right? Like how do we address the injustices that we find in our world, in our actual world, where people are not these like um, perfectly rational,
Hmm.
well-informed agents. Um, and there is a kind of, obviously, just the way I described it, you might think, um, well, non-ideal theory seems to be the most obvious thing to do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when anybody thinks about justice and injustice, ordinarily, right? Like again, think about children who see some injustice in the world or what they recognize to be injustice in the world, and think like, how is this okay? Like, how do we fix this problem here? Um, so non-ideal theorists often criticize figures like Rawls, arguing that look, the the priority, the primary thing when thinking about justice or political philosophy broadly is it should be thinking about how to make our society less unjust,
Hmm.
how to solve these actual problems while taking people to be how they actually are namely these imperfect beings, rather than being situated in some much more ideal conditions where they're fair-minded or they're well-informed and so on, because actual people are often not like that, right? So that's the natural sort of tension between the two sides. As to what I think are the merits, demerits, I think there's a place for both.
Hmm.
So there are you'll find this is a hotly contested issue in political philosophy, especially in the last 15, 20 years. Um, there's a lot of people who think there's no place for ideal theory. Like ideal theory is pretty much useless. It's not
Mm.
really necessary or sufficient for anything that we should be concerned about when we're doing political philosophy. Um, and then there's people who take a more ecumenical approach and they think, well, look, there's space for both.
Hmm.
Um, but even among them, even among the latter group, they might have a position on which they take to be the most basic or the prior or the more fundamental
Yeah.
um, uh, way of approaching things, right? So Rawls, for instance, thought ideal theory is prior to non-ideal theory. You do ideal theory, you first figure out what the just society looks like, and then that gives you a systematic basis upon which to then um, think about how to make reforms in our actual unjust world. So he didn't his view was not that, oh, you just do ideal theory and then you're done, political philosophy is done. No, he was absolutely interested in um, how to resolve all kinds of injustices that we see today, right?
Yeah.
Um, but his thought was, look, if we want to have a systematic grasp of these issues, then you ought to do ideal theory first.
Hmm.
Um, I think roughly, I think that's roughly right. I think showing that that's the case is the work that the ideal theorist needs to do, and it's not been shown that much yet. I don't think Rawls did enough to show it, and I think Rawls was also quite. He says things in various places um, that are confusing, maybe even a little sloppy, but there is, I think, a lot of merit in the overall approach. I do think that if we're thinking about injustice, we need to think about um, what does the absence of injustice look like for us to be able to say that some particular proposal is a solution to the injustice that we face,
Hmm.
and um, that means we have to have a sense of what um, oh, sorry, it looks like my
Yeah.
camera just turned off. That was, there you go, it's back on. I don't know if that messes with the recording, but um, so it seems to me that non-ideal theory should be based upon an idea of um, what a society in which there are no injustices, or at least some standard for assessing what counts as an injustice, what counts as justice, right? And then to say, look, okay, we have the standard, and then we can say, okay, let's implement ABC solutions
Hmm.
to uh, remedy these injustices.
Sure.
And so we need to figure out what that standard is. Um, Ideal theorists, at least Rawlsian ideal theorists, not all ideal theorists are in agreement with Rawls, but Rawlsian ideal theorists think that the way you figure out what that standard is by doing ideal theory.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that view is roughly right. I,
Hmm.
I think, yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah. I think that certainly makes sense. And it's obviously difficult to create like sort of generalities about when is something useful versus the other. So How about we focus on like a specific case, which I know you've, studied before, which is gun regulation. So could you talk a little bit about the role of ideal versus non-ideal theory in self-defense implications? How does each theory sort of frame self-defense? And then sort of the conclusions that you've come to.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think gun regulation is possibly it's a maybe it's a nice case of non-ideal theory, right? So we're dealing with people who use firearms to commit
Yeah.
wrongs against other people, and the question is, what do we do about this? Um, um, the the natural argument for um, allowing people to have or bear the right to arms is the argument from self-defense, right? So we have the right to life, we have a right to bodily autonomy and a right to safety, and these are at least negative rights, meaning that they're rights against interference from others or from third parties. And if we have these rights, then it seems like we cannot reasonably protect these rights if we don't have something like the right to self-defense,
Hmm.
right? So your right to life, maybe the most basic right you have, to the extent that you have any rights at all, seems to require, it's not, it doesn't, maybe it's not analytic, but it seems to require that you have the right to um, resist others who are threatening your life.
Hmm.
And you can say similar things about your right to safety, your right to bodily integrity. So the right to self-defense is a very natural thing that almost straightforwardly falls out of your right to life and bodily integrity. Um, and defenders of guns argue that, well, look, if you have the right to self-defense, then you have the right to guns, because the right to self-defense has to entail a right to use means, even violent means, to um, to exercise self-defense, um, and guns do precisely that. So that's the standard argument. Um, how do we square this with the fact that guns also are used to harm others, right? So they're a public safety concern. So how do we balance the rights of people who want to use guns to defend themselves with those who are concerned that guns are going to be used against them or their loved ones? Um, that's that's a question you could ask. I think you can ask this question both in the non-ideal theory and the ideal theory level. So one thing you could wonder about is, like, even in the ideal, like perfectly just society, would we have the right to guns, right? Would we have the right? Now you might say, well, that depends. I mean, if the government is virtuous and all that, like, why do we need to? Or if people are virtuous, then why do we need to worry about others threatening us? Why do we need to um, use guns
Hmm.
at all against each other? But you might at the same time think, well, um, doesn't this depend on how virtuous we conceive people to be, right? So if you think of people as being perfectly virtuous, right, angels, uh, sure. But if you think of people as being kind of generally reasonable to each other, but also capable of violence, maybe because they perceive something as a threat reasonably, right? Maybe they enter a dispute and with somebody else, and they reasonably perceive the other person to be a threat, and so then they might, under those kinds of circumstances, engage in violence. Um, and might want to use violent means like the gun, right? So if we think of people as being not so perfectly virtuous, then you might think, well, look, we might need guns as an assurance, right? As a form of insurance, even from um, these sorts of possible threats. So you could ask the question in ideal theory. Obviously, the most natural thing to do is to ask the question in non-ideal theory.
Hmm.
And under non-ideal theory conditions, I think ultimately the discussion or the debate comes down to empirical facts, actually. So because anyone who's a defender of guns, if they're providing a plausible, reasonable defense of guns, they will concede that it is possible that our right to guns, based on the right to self-defense, can be outweighed by other considerations, like the fact that society is heavily harmed by widespread availability of guns or widespread use of guns to commit crimes and wrong others, right? So these sorts of competing utilitarian sort of
Yeah.
considerations might outweigh the rights-based defense of guns. But these defenders of guns argue, well, this can only work if those competing considerations are really sufficiently strong, meaning there's really good evidence that there's a lot of harm that can be done, or is done rather, to people in society from the use of guns. So if such evidence can be shown, then sure, that strong right to self-defense can be outweighed. Because generally people think that if you have rights, your rights are not absolute. Rights can be strong, but they can still be outweighed. So if you can provide good empirical evidence that there is such significant social cost, then the rights can be outweighed.
Uh, I think that makes sense. And it seems like there's sort of a middle ground between the idealistic and non-ideal ways of approaching this question. But how would you go about sort of weighing like a potential rights violation versus some social cost? Like, what is the way of sort of weighing between those two consequences?
Yeah, the natural thing to say in these cases is the sort of thing I just said, which is that um, if you have rights, that means, and if these are negative rights, then the rights against third parties that they not interfere in um, the very thing that you have a right to. Um, but we need to think about how strong this right is. So if the right is the stronger the right, the more difficult it is to override that right. Right, the more
Hmm.
difficult it is to show that something else is even more important. Um, of course, if you take the right to be absolute, which most people who defend rights of any kind don't take rights to be absolute, meaning they don't take that they don't hold the view that the rights can never be overridden by anything else. So they want to say, look, yeah, in some cases at least they can be overridden. So that's the sort of natural dispute between rights and sort of social utility, right?
Hmm.
So people have rights, but then there's the question about like what is beneficial to society overall, and when these things compete, the way we resolve this issue is by looking to see if the benefits to society from um, um, imposing a rule or performing an action that would otherwise violate your rights actually is greater than the benefit to sorry, there is more moral value than if we were to just stick to respecting your
Hmm.
rights, right? So that's the natural thing to say.
Hmm.
And so in this case, like I just mentioned, you might think, yeah, like gun regulation can be justified, even stringent gun regulation can be justified if the benefits can be shown to outweigh the costs,
Hmm.
namely the restrictions on people's right to
Sure.
use guns as a means of self-defense.
Sure. So are there other such topics where you sort of see this conflict between competing rights that might interest you, if we were to move off the discussion of self-defense?
Um, yeah, so the general contest between rights and utility is it's you'll find this in many different areas. So you um, with any kind of or with most sorts of political restrictions on people's freedoms, um, you might you might see a similar kind of this debate play out, right? So, for instance, restrictions on um, corporations or restrictions on um, think about sort of like seatbelt laws, or think about um, laws that require you to um, not speed, or
Hmm.
laws that ban smoking in certain areas,
Hmm.
right, and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of restrictions that most states impose on people, and many of these, I'm not saying that's true in every case, but in many of these cases, um, you can frame the ethical discussion here as a dispute between those who say, look, don't I have the right to freely choose for myself with respect to that
Yeah.
kind of conduct that is now banned, and the benefit to society, right, that comes from imposing that ban.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems in a lot of these cases that you mentioned, like, speeding, seatbelts, or like cigarette smoking, it seems that we have collectively agreed that social externalities outweigh whatever right that an individual has. Can you think of any case where the opposite might be true, where like an individual's right can be considered more morally valuable than like the social consequence?
Yeah, I think if you think about the United States, the most obvious sorts of examples involve things like your right to speech, um, your right to um, political protest, which is maybe is an extension of your right to speech, right?
Hmm.
Um, um, you can think of the way that property rights are protected in the United States as maybe also an example of this, right?
Mm.
Um, in other liberal societies, even um, you don't get such stringent protections of property rights that you do get, say, in the U.S. You have, for
Hmm.
instance, tougher taxes, right? More regulations, or different kinds of regulations, at least, that constrain, where people can live, and under, how big the houses they can build, and so on and so forth, right?
Hmm.
How much property you can own, and so on. So, um, yeah, I think in a society like the U.S., maybe free speech and property rights are the most straightforward examples where
Yeah.
your right to those things is given more weight, at
Yeah.
least, in contrast to whatever social benefits might obtain,
Hmm.
right, from maybe restricting those rights further.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. So we sort of naturally come to this topic of like government. And I know you've
Mm.
written some commentary about this notion of private government and corporations, which also you mentioned. So could you just briefly, summarize exactly what the private government entails, sort of what your work has been about it, and sort of, yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah, so I've done some work um, on this topic, and it's a private government is a, as far as I can tell, not a generally used term in kind of everyday parlance. I think it's from what I can tell, it's a term that was at least popularized, if not first used, by Elizabeth Anderson when she wrote her when she gave her Tanner lectures titled "Private Government," and uh, so here's the kind of general uh, description of what private government is and what the issue is. So the issue concerns uh, the sort of control that employers have over their workers in most modern capitalist societies, in particular places like the United States and the UK, also many places in Europe. Um, and the ethical question concerns whether the sort of control that is exercised by employers over workers is um, morally questionable, right?
Hmm.
Is it morally justified? And the term private government is used by Elizabeth Anderson to communicate the idea that there is a kind of, I suppose, a paradox in the nature of the relationship between workers and their employers in modern capitalist society. So here's the paradox. So ordinarily, we think of things that happen in the public domain and things that happen in the private domain. We think, for instance, that um, uh, what we do in when we vote or when you write a newspaper article, for a major newspaper, that's a kind of public activity, right? Whereas when you're deciding, where to spend the weekend with your family or your spouse and whatnot, that's a private issue, or whether you're going to get married or not or have children, like that's a private matter.
Hmm.
And based on that distinction, we think society should treat these cases differently, right? When
Yeah.
it's a private matter, people should generally be left alone to make their own decisions. Whereas when it's a public matter, then um, then we're answerable to other people
Hmm.
for what we do, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a government official, right, and you use a bunch of money that your organization has to buy yourself a car, for instance, without their consent,
Hmm.
um, you might say, well, then you're answerable to what you just did. Whereas if you use a bunch of money that you have at home to buy a car, you might not be answerable. Maybe you're answerable to your spouse,
Yeah.
right, or your parents, but you're not really answerable to society at
Hmm.
large, right? Whereas you are in the first case. Um, so that's a private-public distinction ordinarily. Now, Elizabeth Anderson basically thinks, look, um, many capitalist workplaces are ones in which the state has essentially decided that um, we will let people choose whether they want to work here or work somewhere else, right? Your employment decisions are your own. So in this sense, the government will not interfere, right? You don't have to answer to anybody. I mean, short of if you break the law, right? You can work for whoever you want, right? Um, and the employer and employee can decide between themselves what the terms of employment are, especially if you have something like at-will employment, which we do in the United States,
Hmm.
meaning there's this freedom to contract, freedom to enter and exit the contract, the employment contract,
Yeah.
whenever you want on both sides, both the employer and employee side. So the that's the impression, but at the same time, employers, in fact, exercise so much more control over workers, um, um, so much control, sorry, that it seems like employers can control workers' life in a way that lets them be unaccountable to their employees, right? So um, they're they're existing in a private domain, but they essentially rule workers' lives, much like a government rules your lives,
Mhm.
but without the accountability that you get, right? So when the government does something to you, you can say, well, you're accountable to me, so you should be answering to me why you did this and that. Why did you, make this change, or why did you impose this law, right? But employers have the same sorts of control over workers in most places, but they're not accountable to their employees,
Mhm.
right? They say, look, if you don't like what I'm doing, you can quit, right? Or they can fire you,
Yeah.
right? Um, and you have no you don't you don't really have viable recourse for various reasons that we can
Yeah.
get into. But yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I guess the economic response to this would be like, employers have incentives or depend on their workers as much as workers depend on employers, so they have incentives to sort of keep each other happy. And I guess why does this incentive break down? Like what is sort of missing so that this is not the case, I guess.
yeah. The incentive argument is not a great one, because it presupposes that workers have roughly something like equal power, right? So if 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 you and I formed recreational, like we're part of some recreational activity, we're doing something together, and you want to continue doing that recreational activity, then with me or with other people in the group, you want to try and at least do enough to keep people in the group.
Hmm.
But that presupposes that um, I can easily leave the group, right? If I'm if
Mm.
I'm not happy, which in recreational cases usually you can.
Yeah.
But if you think about employment cases, right? Think about the cost to workers if they were to quit their jobs versus the cost to employers, right? Um, Even when unemployment levels are low, they're never zero or even close to zero,
Hmm.
right? Low employment might be, maybe 4% or something like that, maybe slightly less. And even when unemployment levels are low, um, the unemployment levels might not be low across the board for all social groups. So, for instance, historically, unemployment levels for um, people in historically marginalized communities has been lower, sorry, higher, right? The unemployment levels have been higher than um, than for the rest of society, right? So, for instance, the Black unemployment level has historically been much higher.
Hmm.
Um, so, if unemployment levels are um, higher, right, then that means that not everyone who is able and available to work is able to find work. And so, if um, your employer does not you so that reduces the incentives for your employer to
Yeah.
try and please you, right? So basically it just means is that they don't have to please you as much because they know that you're desperate to stay in the job because it's hard for you to find another job,
Hmm.
right? So that means then they have power over you because they know you're,
Yeah.
in a sense, you're trapped,
Sure.
right? So um, yeah, yeah, that's yeah. And
Yeah,
if you
no.
think about this, you think about like a sort of Victorian analogy where in Victorian England, like women could not hold property, and they could only hold property sort of indirectly via their husbands,
Hmm.
right? So leaving a marriage sort of leaves you completely
Yeah.
um, without the ability to own anything, right? So that's a dire situation to be in.
Yeah.
Um, so that then gives the husband an
Yeah.
inordinate amount of power over
Sure.
their wives. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I want to return to this question of the public and private spheres. I was just
Hmm.
thinking about this a little bit more, and like I'm struggling to come up with a valid distinction between sort of these two spheres. Like, how would you define the line between what is considered public or private?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's the more you think about it, the harder it is to draw a straight, neat line
Yeah.
between the two. Um, Again, normally we think something like, private relationships, what you do in your personal lives is your private business. I mean, obviously, short of uh, you violating somebody's rights, you can kind of choose who you want to marry, who you want to date, right? Whether you want to have children or not, and so on, who your friends are, who you want to associate with in general. Um, you don't really have to answer to anyone.
Hmm.
It's your business, you might say, right? Um, but we also know that social dynamics, right, in these private domains are often morally suspect, right? So, for instance, we know that even, I mean, this is even just focusing on sort of a society like the United States, where you have gender inequality in the household, for
Mm.
instance, right? Um, and what do you do about this, right? So the natural thing again to say, in a sort of a classical liberal kind of answer, is like, well, look, no, but sure, there's something morally suspect, but the state shouldn't interfere,
Hmm.
right? So there's still something like a private-public distinction. Um, but for us to really say that, we at least have to be confident that exit conditions are of the right sort. So again, if you think about the employment case, right? Like if you don't have viable means of exit, even though legally you can exit, right? The job that you're in, but it's not really viable for you to because it's hard for you to find another job,
Yeah.
right? It takes a long time. It comes with all kinds of costs. You have to move elsewhere, relocate your family, etc., live on unemployment insurance, which might not be enough to pay the bills and so on. So that makes exit not very viable for you, right? And um, there's sort of similar questions you might ask about exit in the private domain, right?
Hmm.
Like the sort of classically private domain of like you know domestic relationships, right? Um, so it's messy. I don't think I have a confident answer as to like whether there is a line, or if there is, then exactly where it is. But I absolutely think that it's not as clear cut as it
Hmm.
at least might appear to be
Sure.
when you think about this initially, or how it's presented to you, maybe. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I
it's
mean,
not a very satisfying answer, I
yeah.
know, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's like, that's the point, I guess, to do what you can, and that probably helps our understanding in some way anyways. Um, so obviously we're running out of time here, but I just have one last sort of topic to briefly talk about, and it has to do with the objective of this podcast, which is about engaging youth audiences. So, do you have any advice for, young people like me, of my age in general, about how they should go about approaching this field, if they're interested in certain topics, etc.?
yeah. I would say with most subjects, I think philosophy, besides being very enriching and important, it can also just be a lot of fun, right? So
Yeah.
it can be a lot of fun to just um, read this stuff, discuss it with your peers, and um, if it's great when you do something and it's fun, but it's even better if you do something it's fun and it's also sort of valuable and enriching in your life in some ways, right? Um, and philosophy, I think, can be both those things. I think it can be a lot of fun and very enriching. And my advice, I would say, is um, if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of questions, uh, especially as a young adult or as a high school student, Um, pick up an introduction to philosophy, one of maybe the smaller introductions, because there's lots out there, and some of them are very they're longer than others, and don't be afraid to dive in and explore. I think it would be great if there was more philosophy offered at the high school levels. We briefly mentioned, we talked about this, but I think, uh, yeah, philosophy is the sort of thing that, also the more it can be quite intimidating initially
Hmm.
if you haven't gotten any exposure to it, but at bottom, philosophers are investigating things just more carefully, the kinds of things that you're invariably going to be thinking and talking about to people around you anyway at various points in your life. Um, so don't be dismayed if you find it intimidating
Hmm.
initially. Um, it can be it can be a genuinely clarifying, um, um, a life affirming sort of thing. I think if you really sort of embrace it, regardless again of whether you study it in the classroom or not. I
Yeah.
think just kind of reading and thinking about it, can be incredibly valuable and beneficial
Yeah.
to everyone. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Are there any like specific books that you think are particularly important? Like you mentioned, you got interested during your undergraduate time. Was there anything you read that was important?
I mean, I took it in the classroom. I took philosophy in the classroom. I mean, I when I was reading philosophy casually as a high school student, I remember reading The Problems of Philosophy, by Bertrand Russell. I remember, um, I was also reading Skeptical Essays. He has a collection. Um, but there are many good short introductions to philosophy out there. Nothing in particular comes to mind right now, but
Sure.
um, there are many out there. You can go look for them. There many of them also written by professional philosophers active in the discipline.
Hmm.
Um, um, uh, I think, yeah, when I was an undergraduate, I think reading, um, Plato's Dialogues
Hmm.
was one of my first sort of serious introductions, like for a lot of people. I think, especially in my case, I thought reading Descartes' Meditations uh, was just fascinating. Just sort of looking at the method. I think Hume actually is often a quite uh, good introduction because he's got a quite incisive writing style, that's also still accessible. He makes complicated things look easy, even though they're actually complicated, right? So, but he can be a great, I think, also one of the slight, maybe more accessible, but also really obviously one of the most
Sure.
important philosophers out there. So, those are some of the ones that come to mind. Yeah, yeah. But I would say if you're really starting out, there are introductions out there that
Yeah.
can kind of get you exposed to some of the most basic topics, and then you kind of go from there and
Sure.
read more. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. So I think that about wraps up our session for today. Thank you, Professor, for your time, and I certainly learned a lot and it sort of connected a lot of the dots in my head, and I'm sure our audience was interested as well. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.